Cold-blooded bikers laugh at a young soldier. When he acts, they freeze in fear. In the small town of Millfield, a dusty diner sat at the edge of the highway. It was a quiet night, the kind where even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of coffee and fried food, and the only sounds were the clink of silverware and the occasional burst of raucous laughter from the back corner. There, crowded around a table, sat the notorious Skull Crushers motorcycle gang. They were a fearsome sight, clad in black leather and adorned with tattoos of skulls and flames. At the head of the table was their leader, a mountain of a man named Razor. He had a face like carved stone and eyes that glinted with cruelty. As the waitress, a plump woman named Doris, made her way over to their table with a fresh pot of coffee, Razor grabbed her wrist. "Hey there, sweet thing," he drawled. "How about you sit on my lap and keep me company?" Doris yanked her arm away, sloshing coffee onto the table. "I've told you before, Razor, I'm not interested." Razor's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to say no to me, woman." Just then, the bell above the door jingled and a young man walked in. He was dressed in an army uniform, his cap tucked under his arm. He had a quiet, serious air about him, and he walked with the straight-backed posture of a soldier. Razor's lips curled into a sneer. Well, look what we have here. A little toy soldier, far from home." The soldier ignored him and took a seat at the counter. Doris hurried over, her face softening. "What can I get for you, honey?" "Just a coffee, please," the soldier said. His voice was soft but firm. As Doris poured his coffee, Razor and his gang sauntered over. They surrounded the soldier, leering and cracking their knuckles. "You think you're tough, boy?" Razor said. "You think that uniform makes you a man?" The soldier looked up, meeting Razor's gaze steadily. "I don't want any trouble," he said. Razor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Trouble is what we do best, little man. And we're just getting started with you." The soldier's name was Ethan Price. He had grown up in Millfield, but he'd left as soon as he was old enough to enlist. The army had been his ticket out, his chance to make something of himself. He'd seen things, done things, that most people in this sleepy town couldn't even imagine. Now, back home on leave, he found himself in a diner, surrounded by the kind of men he'd hoped to leave behind forever. Men who thrived on intimidation and cruelty, who saw kindness as weakness. As the bikers closed in around him, Ethan felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same calm he'd felt in the heat of battle, when bullets whizzed past his head and the ground shook with explosions. He knew these men, knew their type. They were bullies, plain and simple. And Ethan had never backed down from a bully. Razor leaned in close, his breath hot and foul against Ethan's face. "You're in our town now, boy. And in our town, we make the rules." Ethan looked at him steadily. "I don't care about your rules," he said. "I just want to drink my coffee in peace." Razor's face twisted in anger. He grabbed Ethan by the front of his uniform, hauling him off the stool. "You don't talk to me like that, you little punk." Behind the counter, Doris gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The other patrons watched in fearful silence. Everyone knew what happened to people who crossed the Skull Crushers. But Ethan didn't flinch. He stared into Razor's eyes, his own gaze unwavering. "Take your hands off me," he said quietly. For a moment, Razor looked taken aback. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. Then his shock turned to rage. He pulled back his fist, ready to strike. And then Ethan moved. It was so fast, so fluid, that later, no one could quite say what they'd seen. One moment, Razor had Ethan by the shirt. The next, Ethan had twisted free, his hands a blur. There was a sharp crack, and Razor stumbled back, howling in pain, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The other bikers surged forward, but Ethan was ready. He moved like water, dodging and weaving, his fists and feet finding their marks with unerring precision. Men twice his size crumpled to the ground, groaning and cursing. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Ethan stood in the middle of the diner, his chest heaving, his knuckles bruised and bloody. The skull crushers lay in heaps around him, moaning and twitching. Razor, cradling his broken arm, stared at Ethan with a mix of fear and hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You're a dead man." Ethan met his gaze calmly. "We'll see," he said. As the bikers dragged themselves to their feet and stumbled out of the diner, the other patrons stared at Ethan in awe. Doris hurried over to him, her eyes wide. "Are you all right, honey?" she asked. Ethan managed a small smile. "I'm fine," he said. "But I think I could use that coffee now." Word of what had happened at the diner spread like wildfire through Millfield. By morning, everyone was talking about the young soldier who had single-handedly taken down the skull crushers. At first, people spoke of it in hushed whispers, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid the bikers might be listening. But as the days passed and the gang made no move to retaliate, the whispers grew louder, more excited. For years, the people of Millfield had lived in fear of the skull crushers. They'd watched helplessly as the gang terrorized and exploited anyone they saw as weak or vulnerable. Business owners paid protection money, young women were harassed and assaulted, and anyone who dared to resist was beaten into submission. But now, for the first time, someone had stood up to them. Someone had shown that the skull crushers were not invincible, that they could be beaten. Ethan became a hero overnight. People stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to thank him for his bravery. Children followed him around, staring up at him with wide, admiring eyes. But Ethan shrugged off the praise. "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just did what needed to be done." There were some who agreed with him. Sheriff Tom Hawkins, a gruff, no-nonsense man who had long been frustrated by his inability to rein in the skull crushers, sought Ethan out one afternoon. "What you did was reckless, son," he said. "You're lucky you weren't killed." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not afraid of them." Hawkins sighed. "I know you're not. But you should be. These men are dangerous, Ethan. They won't forget what you did to them." "I know," Ethan said. "But I'm not going to let them control this town anymore. Someone has to stand up to them." Hawkins looked at him for a long moment. "You're a brave man," he said finally. "But you can't do this alone." Ethan nodded. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going to need your help." 2 days after the incident at the diner, Ethan walked into the sheriff's office. Hawkins looked up from his desk, his eyebrows raised. "What can I do for you, son?" he asked. Ethan took a deep breath. "I want to take down the skull crushers," he said. "For good." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's not going to be easy," he said. "These men have been running this town for a long time." "I know," Ethan said. "But we have to try. We can't let them keep terrorizing people." Hawkins nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "But we need a plan. We can't just go in guns blazing." Ethan sat down across from him. "What do you suggest?" Hawkins thought for a moment. "We need to cut off their supply lines," he said. "They get their money from protection rackets, from selling drugs. If we can shut that down, we can weaken them." Ethan nodded. "I can help with that," he said. "I know some people who might be willing to talk." Hawkins looked at him sharply. "You're not thinking of going undercover, are you?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "If that's what it takes." Hawkins sighed. "It's dangerous, Ethan. These men don't play around." "I know," Ethan said. "But I'm willing to take the risk. For this town. For these people." Hawkins was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "But we do this my way. And if things start to go south, you pull out immediately. Understood?" Ethan nodded. "Understood." As he left the sheriff's office, Ethan felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, maybe even deadly. But he also knew he couldn't turn back now. He had started something, and he was going to see it through to the end. No matter what the cost. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Sheriff Hawkins worked tirelessly to gather evidence against the Skull Crushers. They talked to informants, tracked the gang's movements, and slowly began to piece together a picture of their criminal empire. It wasn't easy. The bikers were canny and ruthless, and they had eyes and ears everywhere. More than once, Ethan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, sure he was being watched. But he didn't let it deter him. He knew what was at stake, knew how much the people of Millfield were counting on him. And slowly, bit by bit, they began to make progress. They shut down a drug lab on the outskirts of town, intercepted a shipment of illegal weapons. Each small victory felt like a step closer to their ultimate goal. But the Skull Crushers weren't going down without a fight. They lashed out with increasing violence, targeting anyone they saw as a threat. A local businessman who had refused to pay protection money had his store windows smashed. A young woman who had reported one of the bikers for assault was followed home and beaten. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He had humiliated them, challenged their authority. They wouldn't let that stand. Late one night, as he walked home from the sheriff's office, he heard the rumble of motorcycles behind him. He tensed, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip. The bikes roared up beside him, and he found himself surrounded by a half-dozen Skull Crushers. They were armed to the teeth, their faces twisted in snarls of hatred. Well, one of them said. If it isn't the little hero. Ethan stood his ground, his gaze steady. What do you want? The biker revved his engine. We want you, boy. You've caused us a lot of trouble. Ethan's hand tightened on his gun. I'm not going anywhere with you. The bikers laughed. You don't have a choice, one of them said. And then, with a roar of engines, they charged. Ethan reacted on instinct, diving to the side as the bike screamed past him. He came up firing, his shots echoing in the night air. One of the bikers fell, clutching his leg. Another swerved and crashed into a parked car. But the rest kept coming, circling back around for another pass. Ethan knew he was outgunned and outnumbered. He couldn't win this fight. So he did the only thing he could. He ran. Ethan raced through the darkened streets of Millfield, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the roar of the motorcycles behind him, growing closer with every passing second. He ducked into an alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets and side roads. But they were relentless, their headlights slicing through the darkness like knives. Ethan's lungs burned and his legs ached, but he pushed himself harder, faster. He couldn't let them catch him. He knew what they would do to him if they did. Suddenly, up ahead, he saw a flicker of movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, waving frantically at him. It was Doris, the waitress from the diner. Over here, she hissed. Quickly. Ethan didn't hesitate. He veered toward her, ducking into the narrow doorway she indicated. She slammed the door shut behind them, bolting it securely. They were in a small, dimly lit room, crowded with boxes and crates. It looked like a storage room of some kind. Doris turned to him, her face pale. Are you all right? She asked. Ethan nodded, trying to catch his breath. Thanks to you, he said. How did you know? She shrugged. I heard the bikes. I figured they were coming for you. Ethan leaned against the wall, his head spinning. I don't know what to do, he said. They're not going to stop. Doris laid a hand on his arm. You're not alone, she said. There are people in this town who believe in what you're doing. People who want to help. Ethan looked at her, surprised. Really? She nodded. You've given them hope, Ethan. You've shown them that they don't have to be afraid anymore. Outside, the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. I can't ask them to risk their lives for me, he said. Doris smiled. You don't have to ask, she said. They're ready to fight. For their town. For their freedom. Ethan felt a surge of emotion rise in his chest. For so long, he had felt like he was fighting this battle alone. But now, he realized, he had an army at his back. An army of ordinary people, ready to stand up for what was right. "All right," he said. "Let's do this." The next morning, Ethan and Doris gathered a group of townspeople in the back room of the diner. There were about 20 of them, men and women of all ages, united by their determination to take back their town. Ethan looked out at their faces, seeing the fear and the hope mingled there. He took a deep breath. "I know you're all afraid," he said. "And you have every right to be. The Skull Crushers are dangerous men. They won't go down without a fight." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But we can't let fear control us anymore. For too long, we've let these men terrorize us, let them take what they want and hurt who they want. It's time for that to end." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Ethan felt a surge of pride. These were good people, brave people. They deserved better than to live in fear. "Sheriff Hawkins and I have a plan," he said. "But we can't do it alone. We need your help." He laid out the plan, step by step. They would start by hitting the gang's major money-making operations, the drug labs, the illegal gambling dens, the protection rackets. They would gather evidence, build a case that even the most crooked judge couldn't ignore. And then, when the time was right, they would take the fight to the Skull Crushers themselves. It was a dangerous plan, and Ethan didn't try to pretend otherwise. But as he looked out at the determined faces before him, he knew they were ready. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very way of life. And they would not back down. Over the next few days, the people of Millfield began to mobilize. They gathered in secret, making plans and gathering resources. They learned to shoot, to fight, to protect themselves and each other. And slowly, the tide began to turn. A drug lab went up in flames, the fire department arriving just a little too late to save it. A gambling den was raided, the ringleaders hauled off in handcuffs. The protection money stopped flowing, as business owners banded together to refuse to pay. The Skull Crushers were caught off guard by the sudden resistance. They lashed out with increasing violence, but now they were met with equal force. The people of Millfield were no longer willing to be victims. Ethan stood at the center of the storm, coordinating the resistance efforts with a steady hand. He worked tirelessly, barely stopping to eat or sleep. The lives of everyone in Millfield were on the line, and he would not let them down. But the Skull Crushers were not about to go quietly. Razor, his arm still in a cast from his encounter with Ethan, was filled with a cold, deadly rage. He had built his power on fear, and now that fear was slipping away. He called a meeting of his top lieutenants, his eyes glinting with malice. "This has gone on long enough," he growled. "It's time to show these people who really runs this town." His men nodded, their faces hard. They knew what needed to be done. That night, the Skull Crushers rode through the streets of Millfield, their engines roaring like angry beasts. They fired indiscriminately into homes and businesses, shattering windows and sending people screaming into the night. Ethan and his team were quick to respond, but the damage was done. People were hurt, afraid. The fragile trust they had built was threatening to crumble. Ethan knew they needed to act fast. They needed to hit the Skull Crushers hard, where it would hurt them the most. And he knew just where to strike. The Skull Crushers clubhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a ramshackle building that reeked of stale beer and cigarette smoke. It was where the gang made their plans, where they stored their ill-gotten gains. It was the heart of their operation. And Ethan was going to rip it out. He gathered his team under the cover of darkness, armed to the teeth. They knew this was the moment they had been building toward, the moment that would decide the fate of their town. They moved in silently, taking out the guards with quick, efficient strikes. Then they were inside, moving room by room, securing the building. They found stacks of cash, crates of weapons, enough evidence to put the Skull Crushers away for life. But Ethan knew it wasn't enough. He needed to find Razor. He found him in his office, sitting behind a desk like a king on his throne. Razor looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes cold. "You should have stayed down, boy," he said. "You should have known better than to mess with us." Ethan leveled his gun at him. "It's over, Razor," he said. "Your time in this town is done." Razor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man." Ethan smiled grimly. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "I'm not alone." And with that, the rest of his team flooded into the room, their weapons trained on Razor. The gang leader's eyes widened as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. He had underestimated the people of Millfield. He had underestimated their strength, their resolve. And now, he would pay the price. The raid on the Skull Crushers clubhouse was a turning point. With their leader in custody and their assets seized, the gang was in disarray. They tried to mount a counterattack, but it was too little, too late. The people of Millfield had found their courage, their unity. They would not be cowed again. Ethan and his team worked tirelessly to round up the remaining gang members, to dismantle their criminal network piece by piece. It was a long, hard fight, but with each victory, the town grew stronger, more confident. And at the center of it all was Ethan. He had become more than just a soldier, more than just a hero. He was a symbol of everything Millfield could be: strong, proud, unafraid. People looked to him for guidance, for inspiration. And he gave it freely, never wavering in his commitment to the cause. But even as the town celebrated its triumphs, Ethan knew the fight was not over. The Skull Crushers had been just one symptom of a deeper problem: the corruption and greed that had allowed them to flourish in the first place. If they wanted true, lasting change, they would need to address those issues head-on. They would need to build a new Millfield, one based on justice, on equality, on the belief that every person had value. It was a daunting task, but Ethan knew they were up to the challenge. They had already come so far, accomplished so much. Together, there was nothing they couldn't do. In the weeks and months that followed, Millfield began to transform. With the Skull Crushers gone, new businesses started to open, new opportunities arose. People who had once been too afraid to leave their homes now walked the streets with their heads held high. Ethan watched it all with a sense of pride and wonder. He had set out to save his town, but in the end, the town had saved itself. The people had found the strength within themselves to stand up, to fight for what was right. But even as Millfield prospered, Ethan knew his work was not done. There were other towns, other communities, still living under the shadow of fear and oppression. He had seen firsthand the power of courage, of unity. And he knew he couldn't rest until that power was available to everyone. So he began to travel, to share his story and his skills with those who needed them. He trained people to defend themselves, to organize, to resist. He helped them build the same kind of networks and support systems that had been so crucial in Millfield. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, challenges, moments of doubt. But Ethan never lost sight of his goal: a world where no one had to live in fear, where everyone had the chance to thrive. And with each small victory, each community that stood up and said, "No more," he knew they were getting closer. Back in Millfield, life went on. The scars of the past would never fully heal, but the town was learning to move forward, to build something new and better. Doris, the woman who had once been a frightened waitress, was now a leader in her own right. She had started a community center, a place where people could come together to learn, to support each other, to heal. Sheriff Hawkins, the gruff lawman who had once struggled to keep the peace, now had a team of deputies he could trust, men and women committed to serving and protecting their town. And everywhere, there were signs of hope, of resilience. Gardens bloomed in once vacant lots, murals brightened the walls of old buildings. Children played in the streets, their laughter ringing out like a promise of better days to come. Ethan returned to Millfield when he could, drawn by the warmth and love he found there. It was his home, the place where he had found his purpose, his calling. And every time he came back, he was struck by how far they had come, by the incredible progress they had made. Millfield was a different place now, a better place. And he knew, deep in his heart, that it was only the beginning. Years passed, and Ethan's work took him far and wide. He saw things he had never imagined, met people from all walks of life. And everywhere he went, he found the same thing, the unquenchable human spirit, the will to fight for a better world. He saw it in the eyes of a young girl who stood up to a corrupt official, in the hands of a farmer who tilled his fields even as drought threatened to destroy his crops. He saw it in the hearts of mothers who banded together to keep their children safe, in the minds of students who dared to dream of a different future. And he knew that no matter how dark the night, dawn was always waiting on the other side. Back in Millfield, the seeds he had planted continued to grow. The community center became a hub of activity, a place where people came to learn trades, to start businesses, to find support and friendship. The police force became a model of integrity and service, a beacon of trust in a world that often seemed filled with darkness. And the town itself became a symbol, a shining example of what was possible when people came together, when they refused to be defined by their fear. Ethan knew there would always be challenges, always be those who sought to divide and exploit. But he also knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up, to fight for what was right, there was hope. And that hope, that unshakable belief in the goodness of the human spirit, was the most powerful weapon of all. In the end, Ethan's story became legend. The tale of the soldier who had stood up to the monsters, who had ignited a spark that became a flame, a fire, an inferno of change. But to those who knew him, who had fought beside him, Ethan was more than a legend. He was a friend, a brother, a shining light in a world that often seemed filled with shadow. He had shown them the power of courage, of compassion, of unwavering commitment to a cause greater than any one person. And in doing so, he had changed them all, had helped them become the best versions of themselves. As Ethan looked back on his life, on the winding road that had brought him to this moment, he knew he had no regrets. He had lived a life of purpose, of meaning, of service to others. And he knew that even though his part in the story was nearing its end, the story itself would go on. The flame he had helped to kindle would continue to burn, to light the way for generations to come. Because in the end, that was what mattered most, not the battles won or lost, not the accolades or the fame, but the lives touched, the hearts changed, the seeds of hope planted in even the darkest of soils. Ethan closed his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. He had done his part, had given all he had to give. And now, it was time to rest, to let others take up the fight, to carry the flame forward into a brighter, better future. A future he had helped to create, one small act of courage at a time.